Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Brian Tillett. He's the field CISO for public sector at SYNAC. Brian, good to have you with us.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys having me here.
And let's get right into it. You guys have sort of coined a new term. Everyone knows penetration testing. It's something you do to make sure your bank is okay or to make sure that your cyber defenses are okay. Penetration testing as a service, PTaaS. Tell us about that and how it works and what the benefits are.
So thank you. I appreciate it. So when I first came to SYNAC and I was first learning about the space, now called PTaaS, or penetration testing as a service, I said, wait a minute, isn't penetration testing, hasn't it always been a service? Hasn't it always been delivered as a service? And I quickly found out the differences between now how things have changed between the old work and the new work of things. So the biggest difference between penetration testing as a service and specifically how SYNAC is doing it, is we've built a platform. Not only is that platform a software platform that we deliver with the service, but we've also made the investment to make it FedRAMP moderate designated as well. But the unique piece of PTaaS and how this works is no matter what type of asset you are penetration testing, app, API, web, even an AI or a large language model instantiation, no matter how you're testing it, you get a uniform report. So everything looks exactly the same. You get actionable intelligence and everything is presented to you through a trusted platform, as opposed to the old school way of doing things, which is 2 weeks, 2 people in a conference room, and a couple of weeks after that penetration test is done, you might get an asynchronous PDF or a PowerPoint presentation or Excel spreadsheet with what your vulnerabilities might have been. So that's the biggest difference between how PTaaS has really shaped and changed penetration testing as of late.
And what form does the test itself take? I mean, it's kind of a generalized term, but there's many attack vectors and many methodologies of getting into software. Tell us about some of the qualities or manners in which it does its testing.
Once we kick off a mission through penetration testing, we basically assign a cohort or a group of penetration testers to that specific asset or whatever it is that we've designated within that mission. Again, a web, a cloud instantiation. So the biggest, and also let me kind of carve out some specific terms because I think these things get blended in the market, is penetration testing versus red teaming. Penetration testing is designed to find your vulnerabilities, document your vulnerabilities. Red teaming is therefore exploiting vulnerabilities and then going into the organization and trying to find trophies, move east or west, move north and south. So the difference here between, again, vulnerability testing and vulnerability management and finding, documenting, and triaging these vulnerabilities is that's the output, or essentially, if you will, the outcome-based approach to penetration testing as a service, which again is different than that old work. And I will say that the last advantage of having a true PTaaS platform, everything coming at you through that platform, is you now have the ability to integrate that into other solutions. So it might be your patching solution, it might be your security operations center, the SIM technology which is behind it. Penetration testing in the old school way as a service delivered by people on site, 8 hours a day for 2 weeks. Again, it's backward looking. It's never had the opportunity to become something that is part of security operations in real time. If we have a security researcher that finds a vulnerability that is being perhaps actively exploited or something that the security operations team needs to know about right now, we put that flag right up in the platform and it goes right into the security operations center. Not possible with the old school way of doing security testing.
So it sounds like the penetration testing platform is not itself an automated routine. You actually have people
absolutely.
brought in for a specific...
There are automated portions of it, kind of the kickoff, and if you will, kind of the discovery aspects of it. But there's, again, the penetration testing aspect of it, truly going and finding your vulnerabilities, documenting them, making literally a recording of what you've been able to find so it can be replayed back to your responders inside the organization. All that is human-led effort.
Interesting. And when does this take place in the software lifecycle or throughout?
Strong question. So we have, in the tradition of developing software, whether you're talking about a software factory or you're offshoring, and if you're talking about commercial or enterprise type of organizations, or whatever it might be when you're developing solutions for a submarine or for control systems for an airplane, or whether it might be the mission control systems for a federal civilian financial institution. We typically pay and we incentivize our developers to develop quickly, but we don't necessarily incentivize them to develop securely. So security has in the tradition of security operations and merging it into software development, security's kind of been bolted on at the end. And the security team does the penetration testing last minute before it goes live. And all of a sudden we find the software or the instantiation we're testing is full of holes, full of vulnerabilities, and we have to roll back into the development lifecycle and we miss the window. So in the case of you're working with the military, you've only got 3 weeks that a submarine or a ship might be above water and in port. And if you're trying to make that window and a week before the sub shows up, you find out that the application is full of holes or the software is broken, guess what? Now we've missed that mission entirely. So by embedding PTaaS, penetration testing as a service, into the software development lifecycle, we literally can make it a step in your waterfall or agile. So by using PTaaS the way we approach it, essentially a 24/7 continuous operation. We've had this notion of continuous monitoring for a long time in the federal government. So now we've adapted that into penetration testing. So overnight, you could literally take your software development lifecycle and do the vulnerability test and the penetration testing into that. And once the developers come back in the morning, figuratively speaking, again, this is a continuous cycle that you've built into DevSecOps as opposed to bolted on at the end.
So in other words, you would test during development when a block of code is finished.
Absolutely.
But maybe again when it's compiled for runtime, because then things happen you might not know about.
Of course.
And then again, I would imagine you'd want to do it when one block is integrated with another, output from another Scrum or cycle.
Or a sprint, exactly.
Sprint
yes.
is the word I'm looking for.
Yep.
And then also when it is integrated into a larger system, sometimes, fair to say, bugs, vulnerabilities turn up that even totally integrated by itself and compiled, you didn't find.
Yes,
Didn't
exactly.
happen.
So, and let me even get to the root of why penetration testing exists. The reason why we penetration test is not to find vulnerabilities. The reason why we penetration test is to reduce vulnerabilities over time. So let's identify the pattern and get to the root cause of why this happened. So every time we have this team build this type of application, it comes out with these 6 vulnerabilities. Why did that happen? So being able to establish that pattern, correlate it, triage it, bring it up in the platform, be able to see that pattern and present it back. Again, we get to that point where we recognize the pattern and now we're able to address that to, again, develop quicker and more securely.
So it sounds like then that this continuous penetration testing as a service is also a way to enable management to evaluate developers.
Absolutely, it could be, yes.
Because the same person is making the same mistake in their syntax or something and creating vulnerabilities.
Yep. In previous organizations I've worked with, I've seen different development teams, almost the gamification of coding. So not just speed of developing code, but the fact of a matter of how fast you can serve the mission or serve the business need. So all that gets measured into software development lifecycle. And again, if you have to go back to the drawing board because it's full of holes, again, now you've reduced your ability to recognize and affect the mission or a business problem. So, and security kind of becomes the bad person in that. And being able to embed cybersecurity in the software development lifecycle in an automated fashion with PTaaS is truly a way to, again, recognize, addressing, and solving the mission quicker.
And what have you found about developer acceptance of that? Because having looked at this kind of thing for probably 40 years, one of the big impediments to different software security and safety verification schemes, and they've changed a lot over the years, is the developers don't like being looked over and monitored in that way. But are we past that at this point?
I think especially with the market that we're talking about here in the federal and the enterprise segments and the type of information, I think it's table stakes. It's just going to have to be that way. We're not talking about open sourcing. We're not talking about the higher education environment in this instance here. And the other thing is, security and applying testing is not like peanut butter. You don't spread it evenly across the entire organization. You protect the mission critical application, the mission critical software, the application that's processing citizen data or making mission critical decisions completely differently than you do the server, which is hosting the cafeteria menu. So by applying a comprehensive, strategic, and risk-based approach to penetration testing, that's where you decide, all right, this one's going to get continuous pen testing, this one's going to get it once every 90 days, this one we're going to touch once every 14 days. That's that risk-based strategic approach to penetration testing, which is enabled by doing it through PTaaS.
And just a crazy detail question, one of the biggest vectors for attackers nowadays is phishing. And phishing-based attacks where you give away credentials and so forth is a different problem than what you might uncover with penetration testing. Or is it?
They definitely overlap. You will see often a phishing attack is from a very targeted, I'm not going to go after everybody that works for the entire organization. I'm going to go after the exec staff, or I'm going to go after senior level management, and knowing that they perhaps have a secretary or an admin that reads that information. So they're specifically going in to target an individual and try and get them to give up their credentials. That's more of, if you were going to measure that or simulate that with a testing scenario, that's more along the lines of red teaming and not penetration testing. Penetration testing would be going after everything that you can find on the attack surface. So attack surface management is definitely a buzzword in the industry right now. I think the one thing that we skip over is basically attack surface discovery. You cannot manage what you cannot see. And that's one of the reasons why we've also integrated attack surface discovery into our platforms as well, and be able to say, all right, think of the surface area of the United States Postal Service. So not only just the major data centers that we know about, but every post office that's out there that has an internet connection, things of that nature, the legacy of those informations, right? Being able to look at that, and there's also something which we call familiarity bias. So if you've got your old school methodologies of doing penetration testing, you've got your typical team that comes in and every 90 days or once a year for a compliance-based test. They're the ones that come in every year and they're like, that's Tom. He's got a server underneath his desk. He's been that way for years, right? But all of a sudden now I find out that Tom's server underneath his desk has a 5G card installed in it because he couldn't get to the websites or he couldn't get to the applications he wanted to. So now he's going out and he's dual homing. So again, being able to discover that attack surface and make sure that that server that wasn't managed by the enterprise because it was underneath Tom's desk for the last 10 years is now another portion of attack surface. And guess what? It's never been patched. So that's the type of thing where attack surface discovery merges into penetration testing.
Okay, we've got some more threads to pull on, but we're going to take a short break here. My guest today is Brian Tillett, the field's CISO for public sector at CINAC. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin on Federal Insights, sponsored by CINAC here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to Federal Insights, sponsored by CINAC here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Brian Tillett, Field CISO for Public Sector at CINAC. I'm your host, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about testing that work which is produced by one organization's coders. But so much of software development, whether military, civilian, or just private organization, is the integration of large open source components with maybe a little bit of coding, relative to the number of lines of code you end up with.
Yes.
Talk about the idea of penetration testing as a service for open source, how that fits into the picture, and whether it should fit into the picture.
It absolutely does. And I think we all learned some lessons in the cybersecurity world, which was after some of the major vulnerabilities that have happened over the last few years. Obviously, there's a whole big list we could go through, but things like SolarWinds and specifically Log4j, we've all asked as security practitioners, as CIOs, that when something gets delivered to the federal government, when it gets delivered to my enterprise, I want to see the SBOM, the software bill of materials. I want to see everything that went into the ingredients before it was produced into an application that I'm now absorbing. And I think there's definitely the appropriate level of applying penetration testing to validating the software bill of materials and being able to say, all right, this is all of the solutions, this is all of the open source, this is all the other coding, which is now a part of the solution, validating what's in there and be able to say, all right, now that I've seen log4j in there, I'd be able to test the entire organization and look for log4j instances, which might not have been in the software bill of materials of the solution that was delivered to me 2 years ago. So I think that's definitely it's a way to apply penetration testing at that strategic or comprehensive level. Again, you're not going to probably apply that. You're not going to want to go search for log4j or something of that nature across the entire organization. You're going to do it risk-based. My highest risk assets, that's the one I want to test first.
And also, components have different versions depending on when you installed it.
Yes.
Because the community might have fixed a problem since it was installed here and you're installing it here now or integrating it here now. So I imagine then that by using this methodology, one's organization can become a better contributor to the open source community at large.
They absolutely can. And I will also say some of the tactics of our adversaries are when an adversary finds a vulnerability that they're able to come in and exploit, we've seen adversaries patch the vulnerability that they came in on to cover their tracks so that nobody else sees that they came in. And there's this notion of closed loop remediation. Did a good guy patch this or did a bad entity patch this? And being able to look at that from a holistic life cycle and be able to say, I patched this once, did it stay patched? I tried to patch this vulnerability over the last 10 years looking at a metric number using vulnerability and penetration testing, say, over the last couple years, how many times did I successfully patch on my first attempt? And that therefore becomes a metric to use cybersecurity to say, I've invested in something and I've moved the risk needle in the correct direction.
All right, let's talk about the latest CISA advocacy about secure by design. Is pen testing a way to get you to secure by design, or is it a way to secure what you have designed?
So I think it's both. I think it's a way to apply this new methodology of, again, looking at this from a risk-based perspective. You need to say, all right, these are my critical assets, this is my mission critical information, this is where citizen data is being processed, this is where government financial data is being processed, and whether it's old work or whether it's new work, definitely that's where you would decide, all right, this is something I would continuously want to test because it's a high touch, high change environment versus something that's been in the environment for 2 or 3 years. I only need to test that maybe once a year or a few times intervally.
And what are the big trends in cyber? I mean, what are you seeing with the accumulated data from penetration testing that people need to know about trends with respect to what bad guys are trying to do or what software current practices are producing in terms of vulnerabilities?
Well, obviously ransomware gets a lot of headlines that's out there right now. So the phishing attacks, and I think the other thing which we also need to be aware of is that our adversaries do not have procurement cycles. They don't have RFPs. They don't have to wait for their government entity to pass the budget. We're literally seeing artificial intelligence embedded in malware tools now. And there were just a couple of articles that came out about this week. So being able to address the fact that our adversaries are sometimes ahead of us on using some of the things that we're also trying to absorb over here, I think are definitely aspects of where we can apply penetration testing, but overall just being able to measure how well we have built things over time. And again, make sure we identify those patterns and make sure we develop more securely over time.
All right, let's talk about this idea that you've mentioned several times. I want to explore this a little bit more, and that is the risk management priority type of approach. Because it sounds easy to say, but on an ongoing basis, it sounds like you need to be dynamic in the way you apply risk management as things get solved, as new issues come up. So maybe discuss, what are the best practices in keeping your risk management relevant to what it is you're actually doing in the organization, and that the risk managers and the developers and the pen testers are all kind of on the same score sheet.
I think this is one of the most difficult challenges as a CISO in the federal government or for enterprise is I go back to one of the earliest definitions in the CISSP book when you kind of go and study for your CISSP is data owner versus data custodian. The data owners all think the data is important. It's the data custodian's responsibility to identify how to protect that information. And that therefore goes into your risk management framework. So being able to build that out over time and look at how things are changing over time is where you're going to decide where my strategic, where my risk, my high risk assets, my high risk data sets are the most vulnerable here. And if it's the FOIA server or something else that's facing the web, again, that's a lower risk type of organizational asset or data set that's in there. And again, being able to track that over time, again, it's one of the most difficult things. And the last thing I'll say on that topic is just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure. They are not congruent. So being able to leverage what you're supposed to do from a compliance perspective and what you need to do from a security perspective, that's also, again, that risk management conversation there, again, what you're trying to protect.
And in that idea, and also related to what you said earlier about AI being embedded in some of the malware, AI, of course, is coming to almost everything everyone does nowadays. And maybe one of the big differences between AI-based software and other software is that in some AI applications, the artificial intelligence is designed to specifically change the logic in the code over time, whereas regular just automation doesn't change the logic. And so when you have logic changing, does that also create new vulnerabilities? And therefore you need to have penetration testing on what you thought were perfectly fine applications as they evolve through AI over time.
So I look at AI and I kind of think of it, we're in the AI infancy, if you will. So we're looking at a revolution as this is going to come through here. And what's the first thing that happens when you specifically focusing on the word infant is what's the first thing you do when you bring an infant home, right? You set up the crib, you set up the playpen, you baby-proof the house. I think that's the same thing here, is once I'm creating an AI instance, I'm definitely creating a padded cell where I want it to execute at. So being able to make sure that I've patched all the holes and all the applications as well as the other data sets that might be going into an AI or large language model, that's where we need to make sure that we're thwarting the potential for data poisoning. And because if your AI engine is consistently improving itself and consistently changing its output based on the more it learns, how are you going to be able to determine when data poisoning took place? The best way for you to do that is be able to make sure that you've made sure all the holes are closed as you develop and as that AI instance grows and changes in its life cycle.
Yes, because the adversaries are probably looking for the places they can inject that poisonous data or that mal data, and so you need to keep a step ahead of them.
Yeah, and it may even just come through the chatbot. So being able to ask the right or wrong question, be able to garner intelligence there. So another reason why we've focused on the OWASP top 10, and we're already doing AI and large language model penetration testing.
All right, in the 30 seconds we have left, there's a talent gap. Can this help fill that talent gap, this kind of penetration testing as a service, and maybe get organizations over the hump faster?
It does, and I think one of the ways that I like addressing this again is that difference between penetration testing and red teaming. There's nobody better to do your red teaming than those that are already involved and have operational relevance. Let me take the burden of vulnerability finding and penetration testing off of the responsibility organization. Let me hand you a convicted and triaged vulnerability, move that over to your red team, and now they can start going in and moving east and west and finding trophies.
All right, thank you for some terrific insight. My guest today has been Brian Tillett, the field CISO for public sector at CINAC. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search CINAC.